The night was a living thing made of crystal light and low laughter. It pulsed through the grand ballroom of the Vanderlei estate, a rhythm set by clinking champagne flutes and the soft murmur of well-practiced conversations. The air itself felt expensive, thick with the sweet perfume of gardenias, arranged in towering sprays, and the subtle, woody scent of fine cigars that lingered from the terrace. He moved through it like a shadow against the sun. Elias, a man in his late 50s, was a study in quiet motion. His uniform, a simple navy blue, was crisp but showed the gentle wear of honest work. His hands, broad and capable, were currently sheathed in soft cotton gloves as he polished the vast, spotless surface of a glass-paneled door. His eyes, a calm gray, didn't wander to the glittering gowns or the sharp tuxedos. They focused on the smudges, the empty glasses left on marble side tables, the faint dusting of pollen from the terrace that dared to settle on the perfect, dark wood floor. For Elias, this wasn't just a job. It was a form of listening. He listened to the room. He heard the nervous tap of a young socialite's heel against the leg of her chair. He heard the slight strain in the head waiter's voice as he directed his staff. He saw the way the light from the 1,000-crystal chandelier above fractured into tiny rainbows on the walls. And he knew, without looking, which bulb had begun to flicker faintly at the edge of the fixture. And in the center of it all, standing on a slightly raised platform of dark oak, was the piano. It wasn't just an instrument. It was a presence. A Bissendorfer concert grand. Its ebony surface was so deeply polished, it seemed to drink in the light of the room and glow from within. Its elegant curves promised a sound richer and more profound than anything else in this house of beautiful things. It was the undisputed star of the evening, waiting for its moment. That moment belonged to the Vanderlei girl. She was everywhere at once, a swirl of silk and adolescent poise. 17, with hair the color of spun gold, she moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who had never known a room that wasn't her own. Her laughter was bright, practiced, and followed by the attentive smiles of the guests. Later, she would perform. It was expected. Her playing of a complicated piece was a tradition at this Future Foundation's gala, a demonstration of the family's cultured generosity, proof that their wealth produced not just power, but beauty. Elias finished at the door and collected a discarded napkin from the floor with a smooth, unobtrusive bend of his knees. As he straightened, his gaze, for the first time that evening, settled on the piano and stayed there. It wasn't a glance of idle curiosity. It was a look of profound recognition, the way a sailor might look at the sea after years on dry land. A deep, silent conversation passed between the man and the instrument across the crowded room. A memory, sharp and unbidden, cut through the hum of the party. Not of this room, but of another, smaller, dustier one. The smell of old wood and mildew, not gardenias. The sound of a metronome's relentless tick, not laughter. The feel of his own small, eager hands, too small then to span an octave, on keys that were chipped and yellowed. The memory was a physical ache, a phantom sensation in his fingertips that even the cotton gloves couldn't mute. He was brought back by the approach of the head butler, a man named Arthur, whose posture was so upright he seemed to defy gravity. "The terrace doors, Elias," Arthur said, his voice a low, confidential murmur. "They're tracking in moisture from the garden. Before the young miss performs, please." Elias nodded, a single slow dip of his head. "Yes, sir." He gathered his cleaning caddy, a neat wooden box containing sprays, cloths, and brushes, and made his way towards the bank of French doors that opened onto the illuminated gardens. As he passed the piano, he allowed himself to drift close enough to feel the cool, still air that seemed to surround it. His gloved hand reached out, almost of its own will, and for a heartbeat, he let his fingertips hover just an inch above the glorious satinwood finish. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. He could feel the potential in the space between his skin and the wood, the way it seemed to hum with silent music. He worked on the terrace doors, methodically wiping away the faint haze of condensation and the tiny smudges left by careless hands. Through the glass, he watched the party outside. A group of men laughed too loudly. A woman threw her head back, the diamonds at her throat catching the light like frozen tears. It was a beautiful picture, but to Elias, it felt like a painting behind glass. He was on the outside, cleaning the frame. When he was done, he stepped back inside. A shift had occurred. The string quartet in the corner had paused. The crowd, guided by some invisible social current, had begun to drift out to the terrace, drawn by the promise of night air and a fresh round of drinks. For a few precious minutes, the magnificent ballroom was nearly empty. The only sounds were the distant murmur from outside and the soft, rhythmic click of his own shoes on the floor as he moved to collect a few stray glasses. And then he was alone. Truly alone. The great room, with its soaring ceilings and silent portraits, seemed to hold its breath. The piano sat in its pool of soft, focused light, waiting to his feet, carry him forward before his mind could protest. He set his caddy down silently on the floor. He peeled off the cotton gloves, stuffing them into his pocket. His bare hands, revealed, told a different story than the rest of him. They were strong, the knuckles slightly enlarged, the skin marked by the honest wear of a lifetime of labor. But they were not rough or clumsy. The fingers were long, and despite everything, they moved with a latent, delicate control. He stood before the Bissendorfer. This time he didn't hesitate. He reached out, and with a reverence usually reserved for holy objects, he let the tip of his index finger trace the perfect, cool curve of the fallboard, the lid that covered the keys. The wood was smoother than any surface he touched in his daily life. It was like touching a dream. His heart, a steady, quiet drum in his chest, began to beat a little faster. He glanced towards the terrace doors. He could see silhouettes, hear the blur of voices. They were occupied. It would take just a second. Just one. With a gentle pressure, he lifted the fallboard. It swung open without a sound, revealing the kingdom within, the alternating landscape of ivory and ebony keys, 88 perfect rectangles of possibility. They seemed to glow with their own inner light. The sight hit him in the chest, a wave of feeling so strong it tightened his throat. It had been years, decades. He extended his right hand. His middle finger, calloused but sensitive, found the one key he sought, dead center in the glorious array. Middle C dot, he pressed down. The note bloomed in the silent room. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence. Pure, clear, resonant, it hung in the air, vibrating through the wood of the piano, through the floor, up through the soles of his shoes, and into his bones. It was a perfect tone, rich and full, the voice of an instrument loved and meticulously cared for. That single note was a universe. It contained every scale he'd ever practiced, every piece he'd ever loved, every hope he'd once clutched as tightly as a boy clutches a precious toy. It was the ghost of a life not lived, speaking in a single, beautiful syllable. He let the note fade, listening as it dissolved into the quiet, a dying star. He closed his eyes just for a second, swimming in the after silence, a silence that now felt different, charged with the echo of what had just been dot. It was in that sacred, private silence that he heard the sharp, clear sound of heels on marble. Click, click. His eyes flew open. Turning, he saw her, the Vanderlei girl. She stood frozen just inside the main archway of the ballroom, two of her friends flanking her like sleek, fashionable shadows. Her perfectly composed face was a mask of utter shock, which quickly curdled into something colder, sharper. Her gaze swept from his face, down his uniform, to his bare hand, which still rested limply, guiltily, over the now silent keys. The spell was shattered. The beautiful, solitary moment collapsed under the weight of her stare. Elias pulled his hand back as if the keys had burned him, the ghost of that perfect C-note still humming in the air between them, an accusation. The click of her heels on the marble was like the crack of a starting pistol. It shattered the warm, private silence that had wrapped around Elias and the piano. He turned, and the look on the girl's face turned the blood in his veins to ice water. It wasn't just surprise. It was a kind of pure, outraged disbelief, as if she had walked in on someone defacing a priceless painting. Her eyes, a bright, sharp blue, went wide, then narrowed. They traveled from his face, down the front of his plain navy uniform, and settled on his hand, his bare, work-worn hand that had just dared to touch something of hers. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The two friends with her, a boy and a girl dressed in clothes that probably cost more than Elias made in a month, just stared, their mouths slightly open. Then she spoke. Her voice cut across the room, clear and cold, every word precisely aimed. "Excuse me." Elias flinched. It was less a question and more a command to cease existing. He took a small, stumbling step back from the piano, his shoulders curling inward on instinct. "What do you think you're doing?" She continued, walking forward slowly, each step an accusation. The party noise from the terrace seemed to fade away, the room shrinking to just the space around the piano. "That is not for you to touch." One of her friends, the boy, let out a soft, snorting laugh, more a puff of air than a sound. It was the worst kind of sound dismissive, confirming her outrage. Elias's mouth was dry. He tried to form words, an apology, an explanation, but they stuck in his throat. He could only shake his head, a slow, helpless movement. She arrived in front of the piano, placing herself firmly between him and the instrument, as if guarding a treasure from a thief. She looked at the open fallboard, at the keys he had exposed, and her disgust deepened. "These keys are ivory and ebony. They're sensitive. Your hands." She let the sentence hang, but her meaning was clear as glass. "Your dirty, working hands." Finally, Elias found his voice. It came out rough, quieter than he intended. "I'm sorry. I was just the note. I wanted to hear it." It sounded foolish even to him, a child's excuse. "The note?" She repeated, her voice dripping with scorn. "It's a concert grand, not a toy in a mall. You could damage it. This instrument is worth more than—" She stopped herself, but the unfinished thought hung in the air. "More than you." The heat of shame flooded Elias's face, burning his ears and the back of his neck. It was an old, familiar feeling, one he had spent a lifetime trying to avoid. It was the feeling of being seen as less, as background noise, as a pair of hands that should be unseen and silent. He looked down at the very hands she had insulted. They were clean. He was meticulous about that, but they were undeniably the hands of a man who worked. The knuckles were a little enlarged, the skin marked by old, faint scars and the permanent traces of labor that no amount of washing could erase. In that moment, under her gaze, they felt like foreign objects, ugly and crude. He slowly reached out and, with a tenderness that contradicted everything she was saying, gently closed the fallboard over the keys. The soft thump of wood meeting wood was a final, sad sound. "I'm very sorry, miss," he murmured again, his eyes fixed on the gleaming wood of the piano lid, now sealed. "It won't happen again." He turned to retrieve his cleaning caddy, his movements stiff. All he wanted was to disappear, to melt into the walls and finish his work in invisible silence. But the moment had gathered an audience. The sharp exchange had drawn attention. A few guests had drifted back in from the terrace, curious about the little drama unfolding in the empty ballroom. They stood in a loose half-circle, their champagne glasses held lightly, watching with polite, interested faces. They saw a flushed, angry teenage girl from a powerful family, and a janitor in a uniform, head bowed, caught in the act of some transgression. The story wrote itself for them. Help overstepping, being put back in its place. A tall, silver-haired man with a neatly trimmed beard detached himself from the small crowd. He was one of the evening's major donors, a man who had built a chain of electronics stores from nothing and liked everyone to know it. His name was Mr. Thorne, and he had a loud, confident voice that carried. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, though it was clear he'd heard most of it. He looked at the girl, offering a smile that was meant to be reassuring. Then his eyes flicked to Elias, and the smile tightened. "This man was touching the piano," the girl said, her voice finding a new, more performative edge with a bigger audience. "After I specifically asked him not to. He doesn't understand what it is." Mr. Thorne nodded slowly, as if considering a complex legal matter. He looked at Elias, who had straightened up, the wooden caddy held in front of him like a shield. "Is that so? You felt the need to play, did you?" Elias met his gaze for a second, then looked away. "No, sir. Not play. I just touched a key. One key." "I apologize. One key," Mr. Thorne echoed, and a chuckle rippled through the watching guests. It wasn't a kind sound. It was the sound of people enjoying a minor spectacle. "Well, one key is a start, I suppose. But the young lady is right. An instrument like this, it requires a certain respect, a certain understanding." He paused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. An idea seemed to strike him, and his eyes lit up with a mischievous, cruel glint. He was a man who enjoyed games where he held all the cards. "Tell you what," he boomed, addressing the room as much as the people involved. "Since there seems to be some musical disagreement, let's settle it. Let's hear it." A confused silence fell. The Vanderlei girl frowned. "Hear what, Mr. Thorne?" "The man's obvious talent," Mr. Thorne said, spreading his hands. "The piano called to him, didn't it? So strongly he couldn't resist. So let him answer. Let him play for us. Show us what has him so fascinated." He turned his full attention to Elias. The challenge in his eyes was unmistakable. It was a trap, beautifully set. A way to twist the knife of humiliation, to turn the janitor's moment of weakness into a public joke. The guests murmured, intrigued. This was better than the string quartet dot. Elias felt the floor tilt under him. The caddy in his hands felt impossibly heavy. I couldn't, sir." "I don't?" "Come now." Mr. Thorne interrupted, his voice jovial, but with a steel edge. "Don't be shy. You weren't shy a moment ago." He gestured grandly toward the piano bench. "Take a seat. Let's see what one key was leading up to." The Vanderlei girl, seeing the direction this was going, recovered her poise. A smug, cold smile touched her lips. She had been insulted, but now she was being avenged in the most delicious way. She would get to watch this man's complete and utter failure. She crossed her arms. "Yes," she said, her voice sweetly poisonous. "Go on, play for us. Show everyone what a cleaner can do with a real instrument." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. All eyes were on Elias, the expectant, amused faces of the guests. The girl's cold stare, Mr. Thorne's challenging grin. There was no escape. Saying no now would just be a different kind of defeat, a confirmation of his lowliness. He stood very still for what felt like a long time, trapped in the spotlight he never wanted. He looked at the piano, that beautiful, silent beast. He looked at his own hands, still gripping the caddy. The shame burning in his chest began to mix with something else, something older and deeper. It was a slow, quiet anger, not at them, but at the years, at the loss, at the cruel joke of this moment. Slowly, carefully, he bent down and set the wooden caddy on the floor. He placed it neatly against the leg of a nearby potted fern. He stood up again, and as he did, something in his posture shifted. The curve went out of his shoulders. The apologetic slump of his spine straightened. He didn't look at the girl, or Mr. Thorne, or any of the watching guests. His eyes were only for the piano. He walked the few steps to the bench. He did not sit down heavily or nervously. He sat with a natural, easy grace that seemed utterly foreign to the man in the uniform just a second before. He adjusted the bench slightly, a small professional motion. He lifted the fallboard once more, revealing the keys. The room was utterly silent now, the only sound the soft rustle of fabric as people leaned in. He looked down at his hands, resting now in his lap. They were the same hands, the worker's hands. But as he flexed them once, slowly, they seemed to tell a different story. Then he placed them gently on the keys, his fingers finding their positions not by searching, but by remembered instinct, like a bird finding its migration path. He took a slow, deep breath and closed his eyes, and then he began to play. The first sound was not a single note, but a chord. It was low, deep, and complex, like a dark stone dropped into a still pond. It didn't ring out brightly. It bloomed in the air of the ballroom, spreading a rich, somber warmth that seemed to push against the very walls. The guests, who had been leaning forward with expectant smirks, flinched back as one, as if physically touched by the sound. This was not the hesitant blinking they had been waiting for. Elias's eyes remained closed. His face, which a moment before had been a mask of shame, was now a landscape of deep concentration and something else, a profound, aching sadness. His hands, those supposedly coarse and clumsy hands, moved over the keys with a fluid, undeniable authority. The muscles in his forearms shifted under his uniform sleeves, not with laborious strain, but with the controlled power of a dancer or a gymnast. The music that poured from the piano was a language they all recognized, even if they didn't know its name. It was Rachmaninoff, the Elegy. It was a piece built not on melody alone, but on feeling, a cascading river of sorrow, nostalgia, and lost beauty. The left hand laid down a rolling, dark foundation, like distant thunder, while the right hand traced melodies that soared and then wept. Falling back into the depths, the Vanderlei girl's arms, which had been crossed tightly over her chest, slowly dropped to her sides. The smug, cold smile was gone, wiped away as if by an invisible hand. Her mouth was slightly open. She stared at Elias's profile, at the way his head tilted slightly, listening to the harmonics of the instrument as if in a private conversation. This was not a man pretending to play. This was a man speaking through the piano, and the voice was one of a master. She had taken lessons since she was 5 from the best teachers money could buy. She knew, with a sickening, dawning certainty, that she could never in her life produce a sound like this. Not with a decade of practice. Not ever got Mr. Thorne, the silver-haired donor, stood frozen. The amused, challenging glint in his eyes had evaporated, replaced by pure, unvarnished shock. The champagne glass in his hand was forgotten. He was a man who appreciated fine things, who collected them. He understood, in that moment, that he was not looking at a janitor. He was witnessing a forgotten artifact of immense value, something priceless and inexplicably out of place. The music was too big, too real, for the cruel little game he had set up. He felt a hot prickle of shame, different from the janitor's, the shame of someone who had mistaken a lion for a stray cat. The music flowed, seamless and powerful. Elias didn't just play the notes. He shaped them. He made the piano whisper, then roar, then sigh. The grand ballroom, designed for chatter and clinking glasses, had become a concert hall. No one coughed. No one moved. A woman near the back felt an unexpected tear trace a path through her powder. Moved by a beauty she hadn't come here to find Dot, and then, as the last, resonant echoes of the elegy's final chord faded into a silence that felt sacred, Elias's hands didn't leave the keys. He didn't open his eyes and bow to the stunned silence. He simply shifted, his body flowing into a new position. His right hand lifted and then fell in a gentle, arpeggiated cascade, a ripple of sound that was like sunlight breaking through the previous piece's clouds. Dot. It was Chopin now. The beginning of the Ballade No. 1 in G minor. If the Rachmaninoff had been a storm of emotion, this was a story, a noble, tragic, and thrilling tale told without words. The tempo was steady but urgent. The melodies were heartbreakingly beautiful, twisting and turning, leading the listeners up to dizzying heights before plunging them into passages of furious, passionate turbulence. Elias was no longer sitting on a bench in a uniform. In the minds of everyone watching, he had vanished. In his place was the music itself. They saw the focus in the line of his jaw, the slight sway of his torso as he leaned into a powerful crescendo, the delicate, spider-like touch of his fingers during a quiet, trembling passage. The contrast between the simple blue cloth of his uniform and the sublime art he was creating was so jarring it was almost painful to see. The head butler, Arthur, had appeared in the arched doorway, drawn by the unearthly silence that had replaced the party's hum. He stood rigid, his professional composure shattered. He had hired this quiet, efficient man. He had given him schedules and keys. He had never once, in all the years, thought to ask anything else of him. The feeling that washed over him was one of colossal, unintentional blindness. The boy who had snorted with laughter earlier just looked down at his own expensive shoes, his face burning with a confusion he couldn't name. The friend beside the Vanderlei girl was openly crying, not understanding why this hurt so much to hear. Elias himself was far away. The room, the people, the shame it had all dissolved. He was in the practice room of his youth, the one with the chipped keys and the single high window. He was in the audition hall he never walked into. He was in all the silent, empty spaces where music had lived in him, locked away for years. His fingers remembered what his mind had tried to forget. They flew over the keys, not as separate digits, but as a single expressive force. The technical demands of the ballade, the roaring octaves, the lightning-fast runs, were met not with struggle, but with a lifetime of muscle memory. Finally, gloriously unleashed, he built the piece to its famous, frantic, devastating finale. The music became a whirlwind, a torrent of notes that seemed impossible for two hands to produce. The sound filled the room to bursting, a magnificent, terrifying storm. And then, with a series of powerful, crashing chords, it ended. Not with a gentle fade, but with a definitive, heart-stopping stop. Silence. It was a different silence than before. It was thick, heavy, ringing with the ghost of the music. It was a silence of awe, of collective breath being held. Elias's hands slowly lowered from the keys and came to rest in his lap. His shoulders rose and fell with a deep, slow breath. The connection was broken. The spell lifted. He was back in the ballroom, under the crystal light, sitting on the piano bench in his custodian's uniform. He opened his eyes. He didn't turn to look at the crowd. He simply looked at the keyboard, at his own hands resting there, as if surprised to find them attached to him. The weight of what he had just done, the exposure of it, began to settle over him, colder than any shame from before. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, a single person began to clap. It was Mr. Thorne. His face was pale, his expression utterly transformed. His clapping was not loud, but it was slow, deliberate, and full of a respect so deep it bordered on reverence. It was like a dam breaking. The applause erupted. It wasn't the polite patter from earlier in the evening. It was thunderous, heartfelt, a wave of sound that shook the crystal in the chandelier. People were on their feet. They were staring at him not with pity or mockery, but with wonder. Elias finally turned. He saw the standing crowd, their stunned faces, their clapping hands. He saw the Vanderlei girl, who was not clapping. She was just staring at him, her eyes red-rimmed, one hand covering her mouth. He saw it all from a great distance. Slowly, stiffly, he stood up from the bench. He gave a small, awkward nod, not a bow. It was the gesture of a man unused to being seen. He turned and took a step toward where he had left his cleaning caddy, as if he might simply pick it up and go back to work, hoping the world would right itself. But Mr. Thorne was already striding forward, cutting him off. The older man reached out, not to shake his hand, but to grasp his shoulder. His voice, when he spoke, was low and choked with an emotion he couldn't control. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely carrying over the fading applause. "In God's name, are you?" The touch on his shoulder was firm, anchoring him to a spot he desperately wanted to flee. Elias looked at Mr. Thorne's hand, then up at his face. The man's expression held none of the earlier mockery. It was raw, intense curiosity, mixed with something like awe. The question hung in the air, louder than the fading applause. "Who in God's name are you?" All around them, the party had transformed. The polite, distant gathering was now a tight, buzzing crowd pressing in, drawn to the center of this unbelievable drama. Champagne glasses were forgotten, held at awkward angles. Every eye was fixed on the man in the Navy uniform. The music had ended, but the shockwave it created was still rippling out, changing everything it touched. Elias opened his mouth, but no sound came. He was a private man. His life was built on quiet routines, on being unseen. This exposure felt more violent than the girl's scorn. He simply shook his head, a small, helpless movement. It was the Vanderlei girl who broke the standstill. She took a step forward, then another, moving as if in a trance. She stopped a few feet from Elias, her earlier anger and haughtiness completely gone. In its place was a dazed, painful humility. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper, but in the new quiet, everyone heard it. I am so sorry." The words were simple, but they cost her everything. Her cheeks were flushed, not with anger now, but with a deep, burning shame. She didn't try to explain or justify. She just stood there, looking at the hands that had created such beauty, the hands she had insulted. "I had no right. I didn't know." Her apology acted like a key, unlocking the paralysis in the room. Mr. Thorne nodded slowly, his grip on Elias's shoulder softening to something more respectful. "She speaks for many of us," he said, his voice carrying. "That was not the playing of a man who just touches a key. That was a lifetime. Please, we need to understand. Where did that come from?" Elias felt the walls closing in. The expectant faces, the silence waiting for his story. It was a different kind of pressure. He looked toward the archway, toward escape, but the head butler, Arthur, was standing there. His usual stern face softened with a look of profound apology. There was no exit. He took a slow, shaky breath. He looked down at his hands again, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, frayed at the edges by emotion he'd kept buried for decades. "It came from a long time ago," he began. He didn't look at the crowd. He spoke to his hands, to the piano, to the memory in the air. From before this, he plucked at the fabric of his uniform sleeve. He told them in pieces, in short, simple sentences. There was no grand speech. He spoke of a small apartment that always smelled of soup and damp, of a mother who cleaned offices at night and saved every extra coin in a rusty tin. She saw something in me, he said. When I was small, I'd tap rhythms on the kitchen table. She found a way. An old upright in the basement of our building. The superintendent let me touch it. He described the feel of those yellowed keys, the way some of them stuck, the way the piano was always out of tune. But to him, it was a palace. A teacher at his school, a kind, weary woman with ink-stained fingers, heard him and offered free lessons after class. She gave me the foundation, he said. She said I had ears and hands. The crowd was utterly still. You could have heard a pedal drop from the gardenia arrangements. It became everything, he continued, his voice gaining a little strength, colored by the ghost of an old passion. By 16, I was winning little competitions, small scholarships. There was a chance, a big one, a pre-college program, a real conservatory audition. He paused, and the hope that had briefly lit his words flickered and died. Then my mother got sick, the kind of sick that doesn't get better, the kind that needs medicine and doctors and time. He didn't elaborate on the fear, the exhaustion, the slow-motion collapse of a dream. He didn't describe the sound of the phone when he called to withdraw from the audition, or the feel of the application papers as he threw them away. He just said, I needed a job, a real one, with health insurance. This was the job I could get. First, cleaning the very halls where I used to go for those free lessons. Then here. He looked up, finally meeting Mr. Thorne's eyes. The music. You don't forget it. It's in here. He tapped his temple. And in here. He looked at his hands. But life closes doors. You lock that room, and you throw away the key. You have to. Because if you think about what's behind the door, you can't get up in the morning to do what needs to be done. He fell silent. The story was out. It wasn't dramatic or full of wild details. It was a simple, heartbreaking story of sacrifice and quiet obligation. It was a story everyone in that wealthy room could understand, even if they had never lived it. It was about family. It was about loss. Mr. Thorne's eyes were bright. And now? He asked, his voice husky. Your mother? Gone, Elias said softly. Years ago. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, a piece of the puzzle that explained why the music might have slipped out tonight. But her memory, it lives on. My younger sister, she has a daughter, a bright girl. She wants to be an engineer. I work so she can have the chances I put down. This final piece landed heavily. He wasn't just a janitor who'd once played piano. He was an uncle, a provider, a man who had traded his own future to shore up the future of others. The uniform was no longer a symbol of low status. It was a badge of silent, unwavering duty. The Vanderlei girl made a small, choked sound. A single tear escaped and traced a clean line down her cheek. She wasn't crying for the music anymore. She was crying for the man, for the sheer, staggering weight of the life he had just described, a life of choices she had never, for 1 second, had to contemplate. Mr. Thorne seemed to make a decision. He turned to face the girl's parents, who had pushed their way to the front of the crowd, their faces pale and solemn. This, he announced, his voice regaining its commanding tone, but now filled with a new purpose, is what real foundation looks like. Not just writing a check, but seeing value where others see none. He turned back to Elias. You have a job here, yes. But a man with your gift? It shouldn't be locked away. It shouldn't only come out by accident, or as a party trick. He glanced at the Vanderlei girl, not with blame, but with a shared understanding of their mistake. The city's old art center, on Grant Avenue. It's being restored. My foundation is a major donor. They need a caretaker, a resident, someone to keep the place, to oversee the building. He took a step closer, his eyes earnest. The salary would be appropriate. But more than that, the main hall has a Steinway. A good one. Not as fine as this, he nodded to the Bissendorfer, but worthy. And part of the job would be to play it. For the community. For school groups. To keep it alive. And, he added, the idea fully forming, we would establish a small scholarship in your mother's name. For a student from a background like yours, who needs a hand, not a handout. It wasn't an offer of charity. It was an offer of restoration. It was a way to give him back the music without taking away his dignity, his role as a working man. It was a bridge between the boy he was and the man he had become. Elias stared at him, overwhelmed. The noise of the crowd, the murmurs of approval, the gentle weeping of a few moved guests, it all seemed to swirl around him. He looked at the Vanderlei girl. She gave a small, tearful nod, as if begging him to say yes, to allow her some fragment of redemption. He looked past them to the grand piano. He thought of the silent, dusty halls of an art center. He thought of his niece's textbooks, and the weight they could lift from his own shoulders. He thought of a piano that he could touch any time, without permission, without shame. He didn't smile. The emotion was too deep for that. But the tight, pained lines around his eyes softened. He gave one slow, firm nod, double quotes. Yes, he said, the word clear in the quiet room. Thank you. I would like to very much. And in that moment, the janitor who had been mocked for touching a piano vanished forever. In his place stood a musician, found. The final applause that night was not for a performance, but for a turning point. It was a confused, grateful sound that followed Elias as Mr. Thorne and the chastened Vanderlei family led him away from the crowd, toward the quieter study off the main hall. The grand ballroom, with its crystal and gossip, felt like a world he was leaving behind. The air in the study was different smelling of old books and polished leather, and the silence was a relief. The details were discussed in hushed, practical tones. The art center job. The salary, which made Elias's breath catch slightly. The scholarship in his mother's name. It was all real. Papers would be drawn up. He would start in 2 weeks. Mr. Thorne did most of the talking, his earlier bluster replaced by a focused, almost paternal energy. The Vanderlei parents spoke little, their expressions a mix of embarrassment and a genuine desire to make amends. Their daughter did not speak at all. She sat in a high-backed chair, knees together, hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the patterned rug. She looked very young. When the meeting was over, Elias insisted on finishing his shift. It was a need for normalcy, for the familiar rhythm of his duties to steady the earthquake inside him. Mr. Thorne wanted to call him a car, to treat him like an honored guest, but Elias quietly refused. My routine, was all he said. They understood. He returned to the emptying ballroom. The party was ending, the guests departing in clusters, their conversations buzzing with the incredible story they would tell for years. They glanced at him now with new eyes, with wonder, with respect as he collected the final stray glasses. He avoided their looks, focusing on the work. He wiped down the now closed Bissendorfer one last time, his cloth moving over the wood with a tenderness that held no fear now. It was just a beautiful instrument again. The magic and the pain had been let out. The Vanderlei girl found him there as he was gathering his things. She approached slowly, like someone nearing a sleeping animal. She began, then stopped. She took a deep breath, trying to find words that were big enough. What you said. About your family. About giving things up. Her voice was small, stripped of all its former sharpness. I've never given up anything. Not really. I just take what's given. I thought that made me special. It just makes me blind. Elias stopped what he was doing and looked at her. The anger was gone from him, too. He saw just a scared, privileged kid who had gotten a brutal lesson about the world. Seeing is a choice, he said, his voice gentle. You can choose to start now. Can I? She swallowed. The Arts Center. When you're there, could I come and listen sometime? Not as a donor. Just to listen. He considered her, then gave a slow nod. If you come to listen, he said, you'd be welcome. It was all the forgiveness she would get, and it was enough. She nodded back, a tear escaping again, but this one seemed quieter, cleaner. She turned and left him to finish his work in peace. ****, 2 weeks later, the Grant Avenue Arts Center was still breathing in the smell of fresh paint and sawdust. The restoration was nearly complete. It was not a grand palace like the Vanderlei estate. It was a sturdy, beautiful old building with high windows that let in bars of dusty, golden light. It felt alive with potential, not with perfection. Elias stood in the main hall. His new uniform was simpler dark trousers, a collared shirt. In his hands were a ring of keys and a clipboard. His title was resident custodian and steward. The Steinway, as Mr. Thorne had promised, stood on the modest stage. It was a well-loved instrument, its dark wood bearing a few gentle scratches, its voice warm and true. For the first few days, he didn't play it. He learned the building. He checked the locks, tested the lights, learned the quirks of the old boiler. He swept the stages and dusted the seats. It was his space. The profound quiet was a companion. And one afternoon, when the sun was slating through the west windows, he finished his rounds and walked to the stage. He sat on the piano bench, a familiar feel both strange and comforting. He opened the fallboard. He played a simple scale, then a chord. The sound filled the hollow hall, bouncing off the empty seats, coming back to him. It was a conversation with the room itself. He began to play. Not Rachmaninoff or Chopin, not the music of shock and revelation. He played a gentle, melancholic piece by Satie. It was music for an empty hall, for sunlight and dust motes. He played for the joy of it, for the simple, astounding fact that he could. A soft click echoed in the hall. The main door had opened. Elias's hand stilled on the keys, the last note fading. He turned. In the doorway stood a girl of about 12. She wore a school backpack that seemed too big for her, and her eyes were wide with a mix of fear and fierce curiosity. She was not the Vanderlei girl. Her clothes were neat but worn, her shoes scuffed. She looked like a memory of himself. "I'm sorry," she blurted out, taking a step back. The door was open. I heard the music. Elias smiled, a real easy smile that softened his whole face. "It's supposed to be open," he said. "This is a place for people to come in." She hesitated. "My school is down the street. My uncle told me about this place. He said there might be a music program, that there's a man who plays." Elias understood. Mr. Thorne's foundation had been spreading the word. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lena," she said softly. "Do you play, Lena?" She shook her head, looking at the floor. "We don't have a piano, but I like to sing, in the choir at school." She looked up, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "The teacher said I have perfect pitch." Elias felt a strange, beautiful symmetry click into place. He gestured to the bench. "Would you like to sit?" She approached slowly, as if the stage were sacred ground. She sat beside him, her backpack thumping to the floor. "This," Elias said, playing a single middle C, "is the center of everything." The note rang out. pure and clear. Your voice when you sing, it comes from here. He touched his own chest. But it finds its home in notes like this one. Let's find yours. He played the C again. Match this. She took a breath, and a tiny, clear note left her lips. It was perfectly, exactly the same pitch. A perfect, untaught match. Elias felt a thrill that had nothing to do with his own past. It was a thrill for her future. Again, he said, playing another note. They sat there as the afternoon light deepened from gold to amber. He showed her simple chords. He explained how songs were built. He didn't teach her a piece. He gave her the first key to the room of music inside her. Her shyness melted away, replaced by a focused, radiant concentration dot. When the light began to fade, she looked at the clock on the wall and jumped. I have to go. My mom will be worried. She scrambled up, slung her backpack over her shoulder, and then stopped. She looked at him, at the piano, at the beautiful, empty hall. Can I come back? This is your place too, Lena, Elias said. The door is open. She beamed, a flash of pure, uncomplicated joy, and then she was gone, her footsteps echoing in the hall. Before the door sighed shut, Elias was alone again. But the silence was different now. It was no longer the silence of a locked room or a finished past. It was the fertile silence of a beginning. It held the echo of a perfect note from a young girl's voice and the promise of more to come. He gently closed the piano lid. He picked up his clipboard and walked through the hall, turning off the lights one by one. The space fell into a soft blue twilight. He stood at the back door, key in hand, and took one last look at the stage, at the shape of the piano in the gloom. He wasn't a prodigy rediscovered. He wasn't a janitor who shocked the world. He was a steward, a bridge, a man who had finally brought his two worlds, the world of work and the world of music, under one roof. He had traded a single night of stunning revenge for this, a lifetime of quiet purpose, of open doors, of passing the key. He turned the lock and stepped out into the cool evening air. The weight of the keys in his pocket a comfort, not a chain. The music was no longer behind him. It was all around him, waiting for tomorrow.